favorite topic of mine. It is a theme that runs through my podcast, which is called She Said, She Said. And in your little tote bags, you have a little notebook with a little card from me with some background on it. Influence has always played a really big role in my life. I started my career on Capitol Hill, come in, and worked in the Bush administration, which is where I met Kathy. Kathy, of course, connected me to Sylvie a few years later. Went to PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I ran public policy strategy, and then ultimately made a pretty big career pivot. I had sort of outgrown what I was doing. It was still challenging, but it was not challenging in the way that was giving me meaning in my life. My kids were getting older. I just simply needed to do something else. And it was quite possibly, not quite possibly, it was the scariest thing I had ever done. Now, in terms of scary things people do all the time, it's not really that scary. But for me, it was really, really scary. Even admitting it is really scary. This idea of influence is something that has been a thread that has followed my life. But until I launched this podcast, it was not something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. So fast forward a bit, I took a teaching gig as an adjunct at American University. And then Kathy introduced me to Sylvie Legere. And Sylvie said, why don't you come to this was the second policy circle summit that they had held, and said, why don't you come and lead a breakout session? And the session was on women using your voices or something to that effect. It was a huge panel of like 8 people. It was a great conversation. I went back home. 4 or 5 days later, Sylvie called me. She had just come in off the treadmill or the bike or some exercise, something. And she said, I have an idea for you. I said, okay. She said, you should start a podcast. I said, well, Sylvie, I've never actually listened to a podcast. This was 5 years ago, November, 5 years ago, exactly. And she said, no, just give it some thought. I have a friend I can introduce you to who can help you get started. And I said, well, I need to think about this first. So I hung up the phone. I did a little bit of research, walked into the living room where my husband was sitting, working on his laptop. And I said, Joel, guess what? I'm starting a podcast. And he was like, I don't know what that is, but good luck. And that was sort of it. So Sylvie connected me with a couple people. And it's just a sort of a quick way of telling you the story that sometimes we fall into those things. And I think the influence that Sylvie has had on my life and on many other people's lives, you all have already experienced that directly. But what the podcast has done for me, and I get to be a Sherpa, for people who listen, I'm crowdsourcing what I think are some of the best, smartest ideas for building influence in your life and career. I get to share stories that when I hear someone else's story, sometimes that reminds me of an element of my own story in which influence has been a really important and prevalent factor. We engage and exist in this model of influence all the time, but we don't always think about the specific building blocks, ultimately. So that's what we do on She Said podcast every week, is basically crowdsourcing this, and I'm getting great ideas from my audience. As I have taken a step back and had a chance to really reflect over some, at this point, about 200 hours of content, and that many plus a few more guests, come on in, that's okay. I've come up with 3 buckets. There are other buckets that help you build influence, but to me there's sort of 3 major ones that I think about. The first one is learning to curate and edit your story. And as part of that, being willing to tell that story. And it's funny because today over lunch, a new friend of mine who also joined me on the podcast, Sheba Phillip, who is amazing, and you guys should meet her. She is most recently the CEO, outgoing CEO of Acola, which is a jewelry company that was based here in Dallas. And I'll tell you more about that story in a minute. But we were talking about the fact that it's really hard for us sometimes, especially as women, to tell our own stories and to even recognize those components of our stories that make our journey so remarkable. And where we see that connecting thread as we move from job to job or experience to experience, and stepping back and saying, okay, how do these pieces all fit together, right? Are you guys familiar with the book Mindset? Okay, Oh, that's okay. Mindset by Carol Dweck. She's a professor at Stanford University. Okay, many of you have probably heard of it or read about her. Her bottom line sort of premise in the book is this. You either approach things with a standpoint focused on what you can learn from a situation, or that you're just innately hardwired to not be able to do that thing. So you might say to yourself, I'm just not good at X, versus I'm not that good at it, but I'm learning, or I can learn this, right? It's this idea of a growth mindset. And it's really an important component as we think about not only curating our stories, but most importantly, editing and reframing them. So that when we have setbacks and failures and things don't go the way that we had originally planned for them to go, we can actually take those failures and pull out the things that we have learned from those experiences, and they become part of that really powerful narrative that really differentiates us from the competition, from other people. It's part of who we are. It's what helps us tell the story of our authentic selves, right? The second bucket that I think is so important is this idea of investing in ourselves. It's what we're all doing here at the Policy Circle. We've carved out all of this time to learn, to engage, to be with each other, right? But sometimes the idea of investing in ourselves, even when I see it now, and I so believe that this is such an important component, hey, come in. It sounds a little selfish, doesn't it, right? But here's the thing. Think about every time you get on an airplane to go on a trip, and the flight attendant says, should there be an emergency, I should know this by heart because, we all fly a lot. Should there be an emergency, make sure you put on your air mask before you put on anybody else's air mask. And the reason for that is so you'll be more helpful to that other person. If you're not doing what you need and investing in yourself, it makes it really, really hard to invest in other people. A friend of mine who's also, well, she's a friend because she's been on the podcast, so I don't want to state that wrong. Are you guys familiar with Carrie Kompakis, she is a Judeo-Christian oriented mom, blogger, and author. She's actually very successful. She's written, 6 or 8 or 10 books on parenting. But what I love about Carrie is that she's very clear-eyed, very direct, but very clear-eyed in terms of the advice that she ultimately gives. Her latest book, which came out in the spring, is called More Than a Mom, which I thought was such a great concept, because the point in the book is if we're not healthy as moms and doing what we need in terms of investing in ourselves, it's really hard to raise healthy kids. It's hard for unhealthy people to raise healthy children. And so, again, it's that concept of investing in yourself so that you're better able to invest in your community. Another huge component of this, again, that completely aligns with what we're talking about and what we're doing here at the Policy Circle, is investing in relationships. And, hello, sorry. Is that the hook? Investing in relationships and in each other and really networking. And thinking about it not just from the standpoint of saying, hey, how are you? It's so nice to meet you. But actually getting your name and learning more about you and understanding that when I decide I'm going to reach out to you for Erin for help, because Erin is doing, what do you do, Erin? She's in insurance. Okay, so I need her perspective on something, right? So before I pick up the phone or get ready to send an email to ask her for a minute of time to, God forbid, pick your brain, right? I'm going to think about what value can I offer to Erin in advance. And so really preparing for those opportunities. Same thing with all the women that you're meeting here at the Policy Circle. Collecting those names and those business cards. What are you going to do with those business cards? Are they going to sit on your dresser or in your hand later? And you're like, oh my gosh, business cards I never followed up, right? Or taking them out, taking a picture of them, putting them, this is what I do. I take a picture of the business cards, put them in an album on my phone so I'll be reminded of that, and maybe with a little note about something about that person of value that maybe I can offer to them. Again, it just illustrates this whole idea of investing in someone else. Even if your goal is to get their help or their input or their investment, whatever that is, thinking about how you can offer value to them. Maybe it's something that you just throw, knowing that maybe you don't have something, but just being oriented toward this idea of adding value is really what helps us build those relationships. Excuse me. Then the third and final bucket is investing with intention. And I loved what Kristen said a couple of minutes ago because it reinforced this point so beautifully, I thought. Thinking about doing something is great and important, obviously, but sometimes, I'll speak for myself here, you can tell me if you relate to this, I can have a tendency, when I start thinking, to think and think and think, and think and think and think, and think and think and think until I've absolutely moved on, but never actually done anything. And all that does is hurts my confidence, or it certainly doesn't build my confidence. Maybe it doesn't hurt it, but it doesn't build my confidence, right? Because I haven't done anything. I haven't moved the ball forward. I haven't taken action on whatever that thing is that I was thinking about, right? So being very intentional and persistent. When you have that idea in your heart or your head, or somebody suggests that thing to you, and there's something about that idea that resonates with you in your soul. Maybe you can't explain it, right? Don't overthink it. Do it, and it will reveal itself to you. Now, that might be kind of controversial, right? In every situation, there are situations where maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense, but let's think big picture here, right? The doing part is the part that helps us build self-confidence. It helps us feel better about ourselves. It also helps us get to the bottom line of whatever that thing is. And by doing it, the answer reveals itself to you in the process. Sometimes it takes doing in order to ultimately get to the point where you can say, oh, this is what that was all along. I just didn't know it, right? We don't have all the answers. We can pray and think all day long, but to me, the answer comes when we do. When we invest in ourselves and in others, when we proactively look for inspiration and not just wait, please inspire me, I need to do whatever, I need help with this, but actually going out and seeking inspiration. It's what we're doing here, right? This idea of being proactive about inspiration. One other story I want to leave with you, which I think is really important in this regard, and it goes back to something that I said a moment ago about both reframing your story and also this idea of being intentional and persistent. So Brittany Underwood, with whom Sheba worked closely for the past several years, is a really interesting person. She is the founder of this company called Ecola that I mentioned, which was based here in Dallas. It's now full-time based in Uganda. But when Brittany was in college, she was in college at Southern Methodist University, just down the road, she went off on a mission trip to Uganda. And I think if you ask Brittany about this experience, Uganda was not necessarily her first choice, okay? So she gets there, she's sort of terrified, doesn't quite know how to react to everything. She's overwhelmed. There's a pastor in this small Ugandan community who said, I want to introduce you to someone. Took Brittany by the hand, took her to meet this woman who was bringing in orphans off the street, giving them food at night, a place to sleep. She was like really making a huge difference in her community with no money and resources to speak of. Brittany was so inspired that she came home and committed to do something to help this woman and these children. She raised money. She ultimately built an orphanage. She got, it was tons of press. It was a huge success for all intents and purposes, with one exception. She realized, literally at the moment when the CNN cameras were rolling in to do a profile piece on her and this great success, that there was no ability to sustain this model economically. And so through tears, she ultimately pulls the plug on her big idea, something that she had worked for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years to ultimately raise the money and get this done, and went back to the drawing board, starting all over. She didn't, there wasn't a model that really made the most sense for this particular community, for their skill set, what that was going to look like. She went back to school, she reached out to her mentors, she got some tough advice, and she ultimately figured out a model that would work. Now, the company's still going through some growing pains, but the reality is she ultimately figured out how to create the model. COVID's been a different story, as Sheba can tell you, but the bottom line of Brittany's story, the reason why I love that story so much and why I continue to remember it, she was my, 63rd episode. We've now done 220 or so. I remember it so clearly because I was struck by the fact that it must have been so incredibly scary to pull the plug on something that everybody else was saying, oh, you're amazing, this is so awesome, right? And it was amazing and awesome, and yet it was not going to help the people that she was really setting out to help. And so the courage to admit when we're wrong and be able to step back and take a look at that and frankly recalibrate our story, not to let those failures and setbacks crush us, but to learn from them and figure out how we're going to get it right the next time. The other little anecdote I'll share about that is the quote that's attributed to Thomas Edison as he was working on creating the light bulb. And it also goes to this idea of mindset. Somebody said, well, you failed 10,000 times. And he's like, sorry, I'm getting the quote wrong. I found 10,000 ways not to do it. Sorry, I wanted to get it right. I found 10,000 ways not to do it. I didn't fail. I found 10,000 ways not to do it. So that, in short, is what we do at She Said podcast, and to illustrate a little bit of some of the stories that have really spoken to me. There's so much content and so many amazing women. I am really, really honored to be here with all of you and to learn from you, and I would love to chat about any aspects of this if you have any questions or thoughts or want to talk about the podcast or starting a podcast and what that has been like. That's a great example of just doing until you figure it out. I'm still figuring it out. Sure. To that piece than we were when we started at the point in which Sylvie said, hey. I guess the only other thing I would say too is, she's a great illustration of somebody who gives people a push. She doesn't just make a suggestion, but she sort of not lays the groundwork, but she gives you a couple of tools. She'll give you a suggestion, which can be really empowering to us. When we need that little push, we need that little nudge, sometimes all we need, or sometimes all that other person needs, is just for someone to say, have you thought about doing this? You'd be really good at that, right? That would be really incredible. And that's what she did for me, and I know she did that for an awful lot of people, and I suspect you guys do this for people all the time. So I will stop with that. If you guys have questions or want to talk about anything else, yeah?
Do you ever fear running out of content?
Yes, every day. But as we say at my house, because I have a teenage son and a 12-year-old, almost a teenage daughter. We talk about fear, especially with her, a lot. And remembering that it's just a feeling. It's not a thing. Unless there's a bear that is chasing you, you're going to be fine. You just need to take a deep breath and figure it out and just keep doing, right? And really believe when you have, like I said before, that feeling that you have that you're doing something that matters and that you're, hopefully serving an audience, whoever that audience may be. I really believe that the women who listen, they're getting value from what we're talking about. They love these women that I talk to and their stories, and there's just such interesting nuggets of wisdom in every conversation that, to me, it's been, I think, one of the most educational things that I've ever done, because I've had a chance to really learn not only about these women and about this idea of influence, but I've learned a lot about myself too. And that's been really remarkable. I'm super grateful to have had the chance to do that, and I never, ever would have predicted that this is where, what I would be doing at this point in my life. So,
How did you build your audience?
I still am building my audience, and I hope you will listen. That will really help me. Just through my network, through investing in my network, through reaching out to women who I knew who had interesting stories and interesting perspectives, and asking them to share the content. Increasingly, I'm doing some partnerships with other groups. I mean, the Policy Circle is a great one, but I'm also connected to a group that is a group of female founders and entrepreneurs that are largely in the creative space, but they're building small businesses, sometimes big businesses. But it's more creative content, and that part's really, really fun because there's a lot of overlap between what I'm doing in creating podcast content and what they're doing, right? They're advertising firms, and they're photographers, and they're bakers, and they're fashion designers and jewelry designers and party planners, and I mean, the list goes on and on. It's an amazing group called the Southern Coterie. So if you are a small business or an entrepreneur or a founder or want to be, it's another great group to plug into. It's very different from this one, with one exception. The women are amazing, just like you guys are, and it's an extraordinarily supportive community, just like this one. And so there's a number of similarities, and it's the reason why I feel so connected to them the way that I feel connected to the Policy Circle. But audience growth is a challenge. And I didn't build this to, it's not designed to be a money-making thing. I mean, I suppose it could be, but I'm never going to be Joe Rogan. I'm never going to get millions of downloads an episode, a few thousand, and I'm okay with that because I know if there's a few thousand people that are listening on a week-to-week basis, then there's value to them, and I'm really listening to her. When she sends me a message on social media, or when she reposts an episode, or when she sends me an email or calls me up, I'm really listening to what she has to say. What was it about that episode that you loved or that you didn't love, right? What could we do better? What could we do more of? And I think through really listening to her is probably the best way to grow that audience, because then she knows I really mean it. I'm really authentic about how much I want to help and how much I want to contribute, and she's much more willing to share it with her friends. So, yeah.
What questions have you found help people feel like you're investing in them?
From the standpoint of guests or from?
Just in general, in your network, in your relationships, when you're in casual conversation, or maybe with your next guest on your podcast.
Yeah, I think doing your homework. I mean, that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I think the most important thing, the most important way that I have seen other people really feel like they are invested in me and in illustrating that connection with a guest, which is really important because sometimes, I have people come on who are nervous. Maybe everyone's nervous, but some people you can tell more than others, right? And so putting them at ease by walking through their story or sharing some weird kernel that I do a ton of research. I'll share some weird little point that will tell them I really care about you. I've cared about you enough to do my homework. I guess that could make some people more nervous, but usually it puts people at ease. And I think that's probably, it may be less about what the question is and more about illustrating that you care because you've spent the time and you're investing in the relationship. And I think that certainly matters as it relates to networking activities, and I think it matters for putting people at ease on a podcast. Yeah.
So earlier in your talk, you spoke about curating your own story. For people who may not find that kind of a natural process, do you have recommendations or ways for people to go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, personally, it is extremely hard to do that for yourself. I think it's something that you need to get help. You need to get a Sylvie to sit down with you and help you walk through your story and look for those elements that you might be missing. You may be that person who who gets it, right? Who spent the time to really reflect and what those big data points are. I mean, everybody's life is different, right? And so you may be that person for whom those clear, bright, shining elements jump out. But my guess is when you sit down and really work with someone and have her or him sit with you, listen to the elements of your story. Maybe it's someone that you don't know as well. Maybe you sort of have somebody that you know well and somebody who's like totally fresh eyes, right? And have them react to what you've told them, right? Try to connect that story with what you think your mission is. If you already have some sense of what you think your mission's going to be, it gives them some groundwork. But basically, it's getting mentorship. It's reaching out to your mentors and getting them to help you figure out what those bright points are in your resume or in your experiences. I think this also is really important for, moms who have maybe taken any women really, but moms in particular who have taken a break from the workforce. We see this usually when we're like 30s, 40s-ish, we've had a child, we go back to work, oh my God, like who can do this? And we decide, let's just take a little break, right? And that 2-year break turns into a 5-year break, turns into a 10-year break, or an 18-year break, as the case may be. And I've had lots of women on the podcast who have done that. And one of the challenges is they decide that they want to go back into the workforce and they don't know how to create that narrative and how to string those things together and to articulate the value of all the incredible work that they've been doing during that 5, 10, 18-year break that they've taken, right? And so it can be helpful to talk to somebody because it's completely doable. There's a great example of that I love is a woman in Chicago. Her name is Mara Smith, and she started one of the few, if not the only, I'm not sure if it's the only, but it's certainly one of the few, female-owned tequila companies. And she started it after taking an 18-year break. She was a tax lawyer. And she was on bed rest with her last child. And she just could not make it all work. So she took an 18-year break. And during COVID, was like having trouble drinking wine. It wasn't working. Her metabolism had changed, as these things tend to happen for some of us, or all of us. And she was like, I can't drink wine. I really like tequila, but tequila, everything I find is sort of oriented toward men. It's marketed to men. The packaging is male. Like everything about it feels masculine. I want something that appeals to me and my friends. And so she created it. And she launched it. I think they put bottles on store shelves. It's still a little hard to get. You can get it on her website in 2021, last year. She met the master distiller. So for it to be real 100% agave tequila, there's this whole process. And you can go back to my podcast and listen to her because it's really a fascinating story of how she did this. But she interviewed master distillers in this little town in Mexico. That's where you have to get the person from this place. You can't do it anywhere else. It has to be there. And she met this woman virtually. They connected. She hired her. They started making the tequila. She's shipping it to Mara. Mara's never been in the same room as this woman until I think last summer. Right? I mean, it's just a great story, right? But she was very clever about how she thought. Now, she did not go for a corporate job, which is a little bit more challenging in terms of thinking about those threads. But it's just a great example of somebody who took what she had been doing, all of these great experiences and skill sets of being a really busy working mom, and turned it into something very different. It's a powerful story.
What was the book you mentioned, the lady at Stanford?
It's called Mindset.
Oh, Mindset.
Yeah. It's really great. If you guys have not read that, I highly recommend it. It's a terrific book.
What's her tequila called?
Her tequila is called Inspiro, which is, for those of you who speak Spanish, it's Spanish for inspiration. Yeah. Yeah, it's good stuff.
So, Laura, I thought you made a very good point about you think, but what you really need to do is do.
Yeah.
And that comes like, again, if you're trying to convince a legislator, you just cannot believe how important and impactful it is for a congressman or woman, a man or woman, or to get a call or a letter or an email or whatever, from someone. So you can think about it.
Yeah.
And all you want, but it really makes a huge difference when you do it. So did you find this is this something you experienced yourself, or you found it from talking to other women, or tell me how you came up with that being one of the...
In terms of that being the thing.
Yeah.
From my own standpoint, I have a tendency to be an overthinker, and I hear an awful lot of women admit to that particular trait. So I think it is something that we do tend to do to ourselves fairly naturally. In some cases, it's not enough to really stop us from doing what we know we're supposed to do anyway, but it might be limiting in terms of how bold we're willing to be, or, you know, again, it's hard to just put one foot in front of the other sometimes and just do it. You put it off. It's easier, right? The path of least resistance. It's also embracing, to some degree, change. You know, and this is such an interesting, I always find this so fascinating because life is nothing if not filled with change. Every second, right? You're changing every second. And the whole goal is you live until you keep changing and changing and changing, and then you don't live anymore, right? Like, it's all about change, and yet we're wired to be the opposite, to be resistant of that. And there's all sorts of reasons why that is the case, but I find that so fascinating. So when it's hard to move forward, we have to remember that that's the wiring. That's not our intellectual brain talking. That's our instinctive brain. And you have to ask yourself, why am I not willing to move forward and just try whatever it happens to be, right? And the fear thing is a real thing. Fear is a big thing for me. I have to work hard on that. This is scary. I mean, talking to y'all, I mean, you guys are brilliant. You know, I've been spending the last 2 days, and there's not a single person that I've met who has not inspired me or motivated me or made me think about things in a new or different way, right? That is scary, right? But I care a lot about what I'm building, and I want to share it, and I want to share the women in my audience. And if this is content that speaks to you, I want to share it with you because I think it's really good. I'm very proud of what we've done. I'm very proud of the people that are willing to come on and join me and share their vulnerability. I mean, that's another piece. Sylvie and I are going to talk about that on the podcast in a few minutes. This idea of vulnerability, which also goes to sort of fear. Being willing to put yourself out there is one of the best ways to build influence because it helps you connect with people. That's a super hard thing to do, I think. Other questions or thoughts about anything? Anybody want to start a podcast? I can give you the basics.
Or just to build on
Yeah.
that, you know, I feel like so much is about fear of failure.
Yeah.
And being okay with failing.
100%.
And when you can be okay with failing, it's okay to lean in and take a little bit of risk.
Mhm.
And so that was one thought, and you know, with that question. And
Yeah.
to your question, you know, so much of our conversation earlier today
Mhm.
was less about what we do, but who we're becoming as
Yeah.
people. And I think that is such a great, as I was thinking about that conversation, like editing my own story, it's not about what I do next after COLA, but who am I becoming as a person? What have I learned? What can I give to other people? That kind of helps with telling our story in a more authentic way.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's absolutely right. It was funny because Sheba and I were sitting and we were giving each other advice. And she's saying, you know, sort of telling me these are some elements in your story that you should think about. And then we turned the tables and we both were laughing because we're like, why is this so hard for us to do to ourselves, right? But it is. It's really hard. Any other questions? How are we on time? I think, yeah, we're done, right? I don't actually know what time it is.
Is the podcast you're going to do with Sylvie, is it live? Can we come watch?
I think it is.
Oh, outstanding. Where
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, exactly. I think it's in the app, but it's at 5 o'clock. It's live. Yeah, and I think it's for Trust Your Voice. I think it's for Sylvie's podcast.
That's right.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, I know because my team produces it.
Oh, good. Oh, thank you.
There's a live link on YouTube, and I think the recording is happening in this room.
Oh, in here. Oh, perfect. Okay, well, you guys can just stick around if you want. Yeah,
And it is in the app.
yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna add Jackie Parker to your list. Oh,